The night had a deceptive calm to it, the kind of quiet that blanketed the streets of Beckham County, Oklahoma, in a false sense of peace. But inside a modest apartment complex on Maplewood Street, the wheels of injustice were already turning. It began with a noise. Not the music softly drifting from Jamal Brooks' apartment, or the easy laughter shared between friends. No, it was something else, a sound that would become the prelude to chaos. Inside, the warm glow of a single lamp illuminated the living room. Jamal, a 33-year-old black man with a broad smile and a calm demeanor, sat on a worn-out couch. His younger brother Malik sprawled out beside him, a basketball at his feet. Across from them, their childhood friend Darius reclined in a chair, teasing Malik about his latest missed shots during their evening pickup game. The laughter was easy, a stark contrast to the hard work that defined their days. The soft music, old-school R&B with a steady rhythm, filled the gaps between their stories. It wasn't loud, just enough to give the small gathering a heartbeat. Jamal leaned back, his eyes flicking to the clock. "Almost midnight. Y'all better not leave me cleaning this place up alone," he joked, earning playful groans from Malik and Darius. Above them, however, a storm was brewing. Margaret Stanton, a wiry woman with graying hair and an ever-present frown, sat in her kitchen, clutching a cup of lukewarm tea. She didn't drink it. Instead, her ears were pricked, her eyes darting to the ceiling as though she could see through the floorboards. "Robert," she snapped, "they're at it again." Her husband, Robert, glanced up from his crossword puzzle. He sighed, his face a mixture of weariness and reluctance. "Margaret, it's not that bad." She shot him a glare, the kind that could slice through steel. "Not that bad? I can't even think with all that racket. I'm calling." She didn't wait for him to protest. The phone was already in her hand. The call was short and curt. "Hello? Yes, this is Margaret Stanton at 1427 Maplewood. The downstairs neighbors are making noise again. We can't sleep." Meanwhile, Jamal and his friends remained blissfully unaware, until they weren't. The blue and red glow of police lights painted the street outside. The soft murmur of tires crunching gravel signaled the arrival of two Beckham County deputies. Deputy Mike Tanner, a tall, imposing figure with a square jaw, stepped out first. His partner, Deputy Greg Simmons, followed, his face unreadable but his body tense. They approached the building with purpose, their boots echoing against the pavement. Jamal heard the knock before he saw the lights. 3 sharp raps against the wood. He exchanged a glance with Malik, who whispered, "Think it's them again?" Jamal's lips tightened into a line. It wasn't the first time Margaret had called the cops on him. He had always let it slide, but tonight something felt different. Opening the door, Jamal was met with Tanner's sharp gaze. "Good evening, officers. Can I help you?" he asked, keeping his voice measured. Tanner wasted no time. "We've had complaints about noise coming from this apartment. You need to keep it down." Jamal blinked. "Noise? Sir, we're just sitting and talking. The music isn't even that loud." Tanner's eyes narrowed, his tone sharpened. "I'm not here to argue. Keep it down or there'll be consequences." Jamal's calm exterior began to crack. "With all due respect, officer, we're not being disruptive. Did you check to see if anyone else heard it? Or is it just the people upstairs again?" Tanner stepped closer, his towering frame looming over Jamal. His hand drifted near his holster. "Watch your tone," he snapped, his voice a low growl. Inside, Malik and Darius watched the exchange, their faces tense. Malik edged forward, his hands half raised in a placating gesture. "Jamal, just let it go, man," he murmured. But Jamal didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or gesture wildly. He just stood his ground, his hands open and his eyes steady. "Let it go?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How many times do we have to let it go? This isn't right." The air felt charged, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Outside, Margaret and Robert Stanton peered through their blinds, their faces pale and distant. Margaret's fingers gripped the curtains so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tanner's voice sliced through the silence. "I said keep it down," he barked. He turned on his heel, but not before muttering something to Simmons, who gave Jamal a fleeting glance, a look that almost seemed apologetic. As the officers walked away, Jamal closed the door with a shaky hand. He turned to Malik and Darius, his jaw tight. "This is what we deal with," he said, his voice quiet but filled with frustration. Malik stared at the floor, while Darius shook his head, muttering, "It's never enough for them, is it?" Above them, Margaret returned to her seat, satisfied. She picked up her tea and took a sip, her lips curling into a faint smile. Below, the tension in Jamal's apartment lingered, heavy and suffocating, like a storm waiting to break. Little did any of them know, the night was far from over. What started as a simple knock at the door would soon spiral into something far more devastating. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm about to break. Deputy Tanner's hand hovered over his radio, his jaw clenched as he glared at Jamal. Without a word, he called for backup. His partner, Simmons, shifted uneasily beside him, his face a mix of frustration and hesitation. He avoided eye contact with Jamal, who stood with his hands slightly raised, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. Malik leaned toward his brother and whispered urgently, "Jamal, just let it go, man. They're not here to listen." But Jamal shook his head, his gaze locked on Tanner. "I've done nothing wrong," Jamal said firmly, his voice steady despite the simmering anger behind it. "We're just sitting in our home. This isn't right." A few minutes later, the sound of screeching tires pierced the quiet street. The arrival of Sheriff David Maddox shattered any hope of reason prevailing. Maddox, a towering man with broad shoulders and a face hardened by years of authority, stepped out of his patrol car. Beside him was his K9, Rex, a large German shepherd with piercing eyes and an air of menace. Maddox surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping over Jamal and the others with cold indifference. His presence alone made Malik and Darius step back instinctively. Jamal, however, remained rooted in place. He had faced unfair treatment before, but this felt different, like a trap slowly closing around him. "This isn't necessary," Jamal said, his voice carrying both anger and desperation. "We're not criminals." Maddox's lips curled into a smirk as he walked closer. He spoke slowly, his voice laced with condescension. "If you weren't guilty, why are you so defensive?" Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his tone even. "Defensive? I'm standing in my own home. I've got every right to question why you're here." The sheriff ignored him and turned to Rex. The dog barked once, loud and sharp, the sound reverberating through the night. Malik flinched, his eyes wide with fear. "Jamal, please," he whispered again. "This isn't worth it." But Jamal wasn't backing down. Not this time. Maddox squared his shoulders and pointed at Jamal. "Get on the ground," he barked. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He raised his hands higher, palms open to show he meant no harm. "I've done nothing wrong," he repeated. Maddox's expression darkened. "I said, get on the ground, now." The bark from Rex grew more aggressive, a low growl rumbling from his chest as the dog strained against the leash. Malik and Darius were frozen, their eyes darting between Jamal and the sheriff. Time seemed to slow as Jamal stood there, refusing to kneel. "I've done nothing wrong," he said again, his voice louder now. Maddox's smirk returned, colder than before. Without hesitation, he gave the command. "Rex, attack." The scene erupted into chaos. Rex lunged forward with a ferocity that sent Malik and Darius stumbling back. Jamal barely had time to react before the dog's teeth sank into his leg. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a searing burn that shot through his body. He screamed, the sound raw and desperate, cutting through the night like a knife. Blood splattered onto the pavement as Rex tore into Jamal's flesh. Maddox stood firm, shouting commands to the dog that only seemed to fuel its aggression. Jamal collapsed to the ground, clutching at his leg as Rex continued his assault. Malik's voice broke through the chaos, screaming his brother's name. "Jamal, stop! Someone stop him!" Darius stood frozen, his hands over his mouth, unable to move or speak. The streetlights cast harsh shadows on the scene, illuminating the horror in stark detail. Jamal's cries grew weaker as the pain overwhelmed him. "I didn't do anything," he gasped, tears streaming down his face. Maddox finally pulled Rex back, but the damage was done. Blood pooled beneath Jamal, soaking into the cracks of the pavement. His breathing was shallow, his face pale from shock and pain. Malik dropped to his knees beside him, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. "You're okay, Jamal. You're okay," he whispered, though his voice cracked with fear. The deputies stood by, their expressions unreadable. Maddox holstered his weapon and spoke into his radio, his tone calm and detached. Suspect apprehended, requesting medical assistance. Suspect. The word cut through Malik like a blade. He glared up at Maddox, his eyes blazing with fury. He's not a suspect. He didn't do anything. You did this. But Maddox didn't respond. He turned away, leading Rex back to the patrol car as though nothing had happened. The next morning, the headlines told a different story. Man hospitalized after alleged resistance during police interaction. The narrative painted Jamal as uncooperative, leaving out the calls for restraint, the pleas for reason. Social media exploded with outrage, the footage captured by a bystander going viral. Some rallied behind Jamal, calling for justice. Others defended the officers, claiming they were simply doing their job. For Jamal, it didn't matter. As he lay in the hospital bed, his leg wrapped in bandages, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had stood his ground, but at what cost? The bite of injustice lingered, deeper than the wounds on his body. Jamal Brooks sat in a wheelchair by the window of Angela Carter's office. The room was simple but neat, with bookshelves stacked with legal volumes and framed photos of Angela with previous clients. Jamal stared out at the busy street below, his hands gripping the wheels of the chair. His once steady confidence now seemed buried under layers of pain and frustration. Angela, a tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, placed a folder on the desk. She was known for taking on the cases others avoided, the messy ones, the ones that exposed ugly truths. She sat across from Jamal, her expression a mix of determination and quiet fury. They unleashed a weapon on you, Angela said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her words cut through the air like a blade. She opened the folder, pulling out photos of Jamal's injuries. The images were stark and unflinching, deep gashes, angry bruises, and swollen tissue. She shook her head. This isn't just excessive force, it's brutality, plain and simple. Jamal's gaze dropped to the photos. He didn't flinch, but his grip on the wheelchair tightened. I keep thinking about that night, he said quietly. His voice was raw, each word heavy with emotion. I keep hearing that dog, feeling the teeth, wondering why. His voice trailed off and he took a shaky breath. Angela leaned forward. You have every right to feel that way, Jamal, but we're not going to let them get away with this. Her tone was steady, her words like a lifeline pulling Jamal out of the fog. Outside, the world was taking notice. The footage of Jamal's attack, captured by a bystander on their phone, had gone viral. News stations replayed the horrifying scene on a loop, sparking outrage across the country. Protests erupted in front of the Beckham County Sheriff's Office. Crowds of people, holding signs that read "No justice, no peace, and stop police brutality," filled the streets. The chants were loud and relentless, a chorus demanding change. Jamal watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, his emotions swinging between gratitude and guilt. They're out there for me, he said to Malik, who sat by his side. But what if it's not enough? What if nothing changes? Malik placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. It's already changing, man. You just can't see it yet. But it is. Angela worked tirelessly to build the case. She combed through hours of body cam footage, police reports, and witness statements. The deeper she dug, the clearer the systemic flaws became. Officers with a history of complaints, a lack of meaningful training, a culture that seemed to prioritize power over accountability. It wasn't just about that night. It was about the system that allowed it to happen. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists, activists, and community members filled the benches, their eyes glued to every movement. Angela stood at the front, her presence commanding. Jamal sat beside her, his wheelchair slightly pushed back, his expression stoic. Angela began with a powerful opening statement. This case is not just about Jamal Brooks, she said, her voice echoing through the room. It's about a pattern of abuse. It's about a system that failed him and countless others like him. And today, we are here to hold that system accountable. The jury watched intently as Angela presented the evidence. She played the body cam footage, the room falling silent as the video showed Sheriff Maddox ordering Rex to attack. The sound of Jamal's screams filled the courtroom, followed by gasps from the audience. Angela paused the video and turned to the jury. This was not a man resisting arrest. This was a man pleading for his dignity. Sheriff Maddox took the stand, his expression as impassive as ever. He wore his badge-like armor, his tone dismissive as Angela questioned him. The K-9 acted within protocol, he claimed, repeating the same line he had given in interviews. But when Angela played the footage again, highlighting Maddox's smirk and casual demeanor, his words rang hollow. The tension in the room was palpable. Angela pressed him further. Do you believe it's acceptable to use a K-9 on a man who posed no immediate threat? Maddox hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. I followed the training I was given. Exactly, Angela said sharply. Training that prioritizes aggression over de-escalation. Training that failed Jamal Brooks. The trial lasted for weeks, each day revealing more about the systemic issues within the Beckham County Sheriff's Department. The community rallied around Jamal, holding vigils and marches. Children painted signs, families shared meals outside the courthouse, and strangers approached Jamal to offer their support. When the verdict finally came, the room held its breath. The jury found in favor of Jamal, awarding him $1,150,000 in damages. There were cheers and tears, hugs and applause, but Jamal's face remained solemn. As the reporters crowded around him, microphones thrust forward, he spoke slowly and deliberately. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about change, real change. The crowd erupted in applause, but Angela placed a hand on his shoulder. You did it, Jamal, she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. We did it, but the fight isn't over. After months of waiting, the final day of the trial had arrived. Jamal Brooks sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting on the smooth wood, fingers nervously tapping. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand tightly, her lips moving silently in prayer. On his other side was Angela Carter, his attorney, flipping through her notes one last time. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs from the gathered crowd, journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. The air felt heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath. The jury filed in slowly, their faces unreadable. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Malik, who gave him a small, reassuring nod from the front row. Darius sat beside him, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the room. We have reached a verdict, the jury foreperson announced, standing with a folded piece of paper in hand. The pause that followed felt like an eternity. Jamal closed his eyes for a brief moment, steeling himself for whatever came next. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Jamal Brooks, the foreperson declared, her voice clear and steady. The defendant, Beckham County, is ordered to pay $1,150,000 in damages. The room erupted in emotion. Jamal's mother let out a cry of relief, tears streaming down her face. Malik stood and clapped, his voice breaking as he shouted, We did it! Darius gripped Jamal's shoulder tightly, his face lit with a rare smile. But Jamal didn't celebrate right away. He sat frozen, staring ahead, the weight of it all sinking in. He had won. They had won. Yet deep inside, he couldn't shake the hollowness creeping through him. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, holding signs and banners with messages like, Justice for Jamal and Stop Police Brutality. The energy was electric, a mix of celebration and righteous anger. Angela Carter stood at a podium, addressing the throng of reporters with conviction. This isn't just about Jamal, she said, her voice firm, cutting through the noise. This case shines a light on the systemic failures of our law enforcement, on how the lives of Black Americans are too often treated as disposable. Today's verdict is a step toward justice, but let's be clear, this fight is far from over. Jamal stood a few feet behind her, leaning on his crutches. His legs, still healing from the K-9 attack, ached with every step, but he refused to sit. He scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of strangers who had come to support him. A young girl held her mother's hand, staring up at Jamal with wide, curious eyes. An older man in a wheelchair raised his fist in solidarity. When it was his turn to speak, Jamal stepped forward slowly. The crowd hushed, His voice was quiet at first, but steady. "I want to thank everyone who stood by me," he began, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "This fight wasn't just for me. It was for all of us who've been told we don't matter. For everyone who's been hurt and ignored." He paused, his throat tightening. "But let's not call this a victory. Not yet. The money doesn't come from the people responsible. It comes from the taxpayers. Sheriff Maddox gets to retire with his pension. Deputies Tanner and Simmons just get to transfer somewhere else. No real accountability." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration mirroring his own. Jamal continued, his voice gaining strength. "This fight isn't over. Until police departments are held accountable for their actions, until real reform happens, this will keep happening. To me, to you, to our children." Applause erupted, but Jamal barely heard it. His mind was already on the road ahead. As the crowd began to disperse, reporters calling out questions, Jamal turned to Angela. "Do you think this changes anything?" he asked quietly. Angela met his gaze, her expression softening. "It changes something, Jamal. Maybe not everything. Not yet. But it's a start." The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop. Messages of support poured in, along with news clips replaying his speech. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #EndPoliceBrutality. Yet, alongside the outpouring of solidarity, there were voices of dissent. Comments accusing him of exaggerating, posts defending the deputies. Jamal scrolled through the messages, his emotions swirling, a mix of gratitude, anger, and exhaustion. He looked out the window of his small apartment, the sunlight streaming in. His young daughter, Mia, toddled into the room, holding her favorite stuffed bear. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft, "are you okay now?" Jamal smiled faintly, lifting her into his lap. "I'm getting there, baby. I'm getting there." The video concludes with a montage of scenes: protesters marching with signs, children painting murals of hope, and Jamal holding Mia close as she giggles. Over it all, the narrator's voice carries a simple but powerful message. How many more Jamals will it take? How many more settlements before we see real change? The fight for justice isn't just one man's battle. It's all of ours.